All right, hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about fibers. And I know on your schedule it says fibers, dyes, and tannins. That was way too ambitious. I have too much to say about fibers. I don't know if we're pretty much going to stick with fibers, although you'll learn more about dyes in your next lab after you're pounding your cup up. So hold on for that. Before I jump into lecture, does anybody have any questions about anything? No. Okay, remember Friday you guys have off, so there's no lab this Friday because we're celebrating Veterans Day. So we'll see you guys next week for lab. If you're interested in fibers, or maybe you weren't before this class, but you are now, there's a number of classes that you can learn more about fibers, and especially in traditional contexts. So there's actually 3 wonderful classes in Hawaiian Studies that are all about Hawaiian fiber arts. Has anybody taken any of these classes? Anybody here? No. Well, we'll check them out. They're really, from what I've heard, they're really fascinating and worthwhile. So if you like doing coconut rope, or if you like pounding kapa, you can learn how to actually do that in a more controlled, aesthetically pleasing way. So the first thing we're going to talk about fibers is cordage. And you guys already are experts in cordage, having gone to this lab last week. But I want to revisit some of the fundamentals of this. Cordage is really important for both fastening objects together, for getting things connected, and also for netting. And both of these are really critical for cultures that don't have access to metal. Because if you don't have screws and you don't have nails, really the only way that you're going to be able to build anything is by tying things together. So Hawaii is an example of one of these places where old Hawaiians didn't have any sort of metal. There's no metal to be found in any great quantity here in Hawaii. So people relied on tying things together to build houses, to build canoes, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. A lot of the things that we take for granted structurally would have been much tougher without access to those things. It's interesting if you read the accounts of Captain Cook, who is the first European to come to Hawaii, in his interaction with Hawaiians, they were fascinated by metal objects, especially nails that were holding these boats together. And so he describes the sort of constant battle with Native Hawaiians that would come on board for various reasons, for trading, and would steal anything that was metal, and would pry nails out of the boat. They'd steal forks and knives and things. And you can imagine they turned those into fish hooks, much easier to work with compared to bone, which they were using previously. This dynamic did not end well for Cook, or for the Hawaiians for that matter. But this is one of the reasons why there are so many plants and so many ways that Hawaiians used plants for cordage. Now, the key to fibers is what they're made out of, right? And so these are long chains of cellulose. You may or may not know much about cellulose. Maybe you know that it's really hard to digest, right? So it's why we're not herbivores. If you're an herbivore and you rely on digesting cellulose to make your living, you're probably something like a cow or other ruminant. You have 4 different stomachs to slowly digest and ferment and break down cellulose over days and weeks. So we don't really do that. If we consume cellulose, we poop it out. If you've ever eaten corn, you know what I'm talking about, right? So we're not good at eating cellulose, but that same character that makes it really tough to digest also makes it stand up to the elements. So it holds up really well. We have fiber cells also in our bodies, as do most animals, muscle fibers, right? And they serve more or less the same function, but as opposed to plant fibers, which are made out of cellulose, animal fibers are mostly made out of proteins. And so if you cook up a steak or chicken, if you heat proteins up, they begin to fall apart, they denature, and you can no longer use them to tie things together, right? Cellulose, not so much. If you heat up cellulose, it's still cellulose, it maintains its structure, and it still is an effective cordage. So there's a lot of qualities to a fiber, right? All plants have fibers, all people have fibers, but they're not all suitable for making cordage or for making cloth out of. There's a lot of qualities that you have to consider. The first quality that you want to think about is elasticity, right? So some things are stretchy and other fibers are not. Stretching is a nice quality to have in some applications, right? You can really tie things down really well if your fabric is stretchy or if your fibers are stretchy. It also means that it can take a shock, like if you're tying something that's really heavy and you're dragging it, it can take that shock of being pulled, it can stretch to accommodate friction, and then bounce back into shape. So that's one quality. Strength is another great quality. You don't want your fibers to snap easily, necessarily. And the other thing that is important for using a fiber is the length of that fiber. So you guys know from weaving together coconut fibers, which are reasonably long, that length is important, because if you're trying to weave together fibers that are only that long, you're going to be there all day twisting those things together to get a rope of any sort of reasonable size. So if you have a fiber that's nice and long, you can weave it together in less time and have more overlap too. So just talking about plant fibers, we find these types of cells all over the plant. And some of the more common types of fiber cells that are used ethnobotanically are seed and fruit fibers. Can anybody give me an example of a useful seed or fruit fiber that they've come across, maybe in this class or elsewhere? Yeah. Yeah, coconut is a great example of a fruit fiber, right? That coir that you guys turned into rope the other day, and for so many other uses. Anybody have any other examples of like a seed fiber or a fruit fiber? We're going to talk a lot about cotton, and so cotton is one of probably the best examples of a fruit fiber that we've used for our own good. We also have bast fibers, which come from phloem tissues, and you recall from your first lab, phloem is that part of that vascular bundle that transports nutrients from the roots of the plants to the leaves, actually the opposite direction, from the leaves of the plants down to the roots. Those are phloem cells, and fibers parallel those phloem conduits and give them structure. So they hold them up and they keep them from collapsing. And then we also have hard fibers, which are mostly extracted from monocot leaf tissue. So these are things like coconut leaves or pandanus leaves that are woven into mats. Those really hard fibers that you find in those leaves, we call these hard fibers. So this is an example of one of these bast fibers from a cell. Imagine if you're looking at a cross-section of a stem right here, each of these little dyed circles is one of these vascular bundles. So this is water and nutrients getting shuffled around the plants. They're thin tubes, and they have these secondary walls that help them maintain their structure. And so this is what we're really talking about when we talk about plant fibers or bast fibers. You can see this in some plants. If you bite into a mango, for example, and you get those fibers stuck in your teeth, you know just how strong those can be. Those are again these fruit fibers, but same idea, the same structure and composition as the things that you find inside a plant. Now, fibers are really important to plants, so the plants don't necessarily give them up very easily for our uses. So people have come up with all different sorts of ways to extract fiber from plants. Retting is the process that you learned about in lab. This is where you take a plant and you soak it in water. And I don't want to call it just fermentation, because fermentation is part of it. So in this stagnant water, there'll be bacteria and fungi that start to eat away at the more labile nutrient sources. So the things that are polysaccharides or proteins will get eaten away, and they'll leave these fibers behind, because those are the hardest things to digest. There's also this physical process that happens when it's sitting in water, where things start to saturate, cells begin to soak up water, and then burst. So it's not just fermentation, there's also a physical process to retting. But this whole combined process of soaking your material in water until everything but the fibers rot away is called retting. That's just the term that we use. Ginning is the process of separating seeds from seed fibers. And what you're looking at here, does anybody know what this is? Cotton gin. Yeah, this is a cotton gin. So this is a machine that was invented that will push these fibers through this sieve, essentially, and deposit the seeds, which are on the left side of this diagram, up on top of this shelf, and just leave the purified cotton that's free of seeds, so just the fibers are left behind, pass through the sieve. And so this cotton gin was a pretty simple invention, but it really is what transformed our country, in particular the South, right? And this is what made cotton plantations so popular and allowed people to really go high throughput and expand plantations, because all of a sudden you could harvest all of this cotton, which required a lot of human labor, stoop over in fields picking cotton. you could throw all of that into these cotton gins and quickly extract all the seeds and turn that into textiles for sale. The next step then, once you have your fibers, whether by retting or by ginning, is spinning. And spinning is this process of connecting fibers together. So any single fiber is going to be pretty short, right? So the longest ones that we see in nature, cotton fibers are maybe that long, coconut fibers are maybe that long. There's other examples that are a little bit longer, but you're not going to make a rope that's 5 inches long. It's not going to do very good. So somehow you have to find a way to combine all those fibers together into one thinner rope that you can then braid or twist into something stronger. And so spinning is one technique that we use for this. And different cultures around the world have come up with different ways of spinning fiber. We have machines that do it. We have factories that can spin vast amounts of fiber. But most of the traditional processes look a little bit something like this. This is just one example that I found from Africa. So this is Burkina Faso. So you see here's her bolus of fiber, and here's her bolus of fiber. This is cotton fiber. And what they're doing is they're spinning it together. They're using this stick, and sometimes they use their feet to spin it around. And that spinning twists those fibers together. And so they're linking all of those fibers up and turning it into a yarn that they can then weave. Anyway, you get the idea. I just want to give some examples. We used to, for this class, send students to Bishop Museum to look at some of the Hawaiian artifacts that they have on display there. I no longer require that because it's really expensive. It's something like $20 for entrance, although there's some days that it's less expensive. But if you have the time or money or volition, I really encourage you to go check out some of these artifacts that they have on display, including some examples of cordage and some also wonderful examples of bark cloth that we're going to talk about in a second. Canoe parts that were lashed together. Certain parts of the canoe would have been lashed together using coconut fiber. So you think about how laborious it was for you guys to make little lengths of coconut rope. Imagine making, yards and yards and yards of this to actually tie the float onto a canoe. It would have taken a lot of time and require a lot of skill. House posts and rafters, again, remember there's no nails, there's no screws. So all of these support beams and the scaffolding for thatch would have been tied together. Again, mostly with coconut rope. Again, requiring lots and lots and lots of rope. And even basic tools like adzes, which is another word for an axe. Typically, these would have been made from bone or from rocks and lashed together onto a hard piece of wood. Again, you'd need something that was really strong to hold the heavy part onto the handle so that you could actually wield that to plow a field or to chop down a tree. So for all these reasons, having a strong, effective cordage was essential for survival. Like really without rope, you just wouldn't be able to survive. So we've talked about coconut, but I want to talk about some of the other plants that was used for this purpose. Probably the most valuable plant that we know of is this plant here, Olana, which is Taushardia latifolia. This is endemic, so this is a plant that's only found here in Hawaii, nowhere else. And as far as we know, it's the only endemic non-food plant that was cultivated by Hawaiians. So this is the only thing that wasn't eaten that Hawaiians found once they got here, liked it, and decided to plant more of it. It's really hard to grow. I know because I've tried. It requires really, really wet conditions. The slugs like to eat it too, so it'll get nailed if you don't really baby it. But what's nice about it is that it's got very, very long fibers, and those fibers are extremely water resistant. So it's an excellent marine cordage. And what's sort of unique about this, this particular fiber is that it's not actually a true fiber. Instead, it's what's known as a leticifer. And that's these ducts. So if you've seen some types of plants, like plumeria is one example, Miley is another example, where if you break off a leaf or a branch, there's a white latex that'll leak out of it. So these leticifers are these conduits. They're these little tubes that conducts that latex through the tissues of the plant. And what you can do is extract these leticifers. They're very long, they're very strong, and they're very water resistant. So this is a favorite cordage for anything that is strong, durable, and waterproof. So people would use it for marine applications and also for capes. Once sailors started visiting Hawaii for trade, once the whalers came, or fur traders started stopping over on their way to Shanghai, they started to see Hawaiians using olana fibers and olana rope, and it quickly became sort of the cordage of choice for mariners from all over the world. So it was really prized trading good, and they would trade for lengths of olana fiber that they could use. I just wanted to throw this in here because when I was young and actually got out into the field, I actually found some patches of olana, and it's really hard to find. There's not much of it growing anymore. This is a patch up in the Tantalus Trail system where you can still find a handful of plants if you look hard enough. This is just some example of uses of these fibers. So you could scrape it from the plant. You'd extract these really long fibers all the way over here on the left, and then you could weave that into ropes and things. Now, because of the growth requirements for olana, you had to live pretty high up in the mountains if you were going to tend to an olana patch. So there were people that would live just up in wet parts of the mountain in a little hut and would tend to patches of olana and then would trade with fishermen down below for fish. But this was somebody's job was just to be growing fields and fields of olana fibers. Here's some example. These are, again, live in Bishop Museum of netting that was made from olana and also fishing line. So this is one example of a type of net, and you can also make much larger nets, pukilau. You go out, throw that into the reef or into the ocean and collect fish and bring it in, or else you could bait a hook and tie it to a length of olana fiber. And it was strong enough that you could actually haul in pretty big fish. Right, and so like I mentioned, the olana cordage is made from these leticifers, right? And so you can find this latex in other plants like breadfruit, mangoes, or papaya, but the cells are especially long and also flexible, unlike the more lignified cells like xylem and phloem, which means you can bend it and stretch it more than most fibers, which made it particularly prized. Other important fiber plants, this is Hibiscus tiliaceus. You see this all over beaches in Hawaii and around river areas. This is probably a Polynesian introduction, and it forms these real tangles. The thing about how is that you can make a real quick and easy cordage out of the bark. So if you just cut a length of how, strip some of the bark, you get a nice long, flexible length of cordage that you can tie real roughly. So like if you're in the forest and you chop down a log and you wanted to haul that log out of the forest, you might just chop a section of how down and use that as this type of quick and dirty cordage for hauling. Coconut we've already talked about at length, so I won't dive into more about the coconut. Hala pandanus is another important fiber plant. So it was brought, you can actually eat the fruit, although it's full of fibers. So you think a mango is bad for getting stuck in your teeth, try eating a pandanus. Anybody ever eaten pandanus fruits? Yeah, so the varieties we get in Hawaii aren't great for eating, but in other parts of the Pacific, there's some that have actually more pulp. But there's not much to it. The fruits are great actually for making paintbrushes. Once they dry out, they have these nice long fibers that you can use for painting. But probably the most utilized part of the pandanus are these nice long leaves. They can be sort of spiky, so you want to cut off the spiky part, and then you can weave that hala into mats. So this was important traditionally. People would put this on the floors of their houses, or sometimes they would make walls out of hala mats. And you can go to any ABC store and buy, a 2x2 square of pandanus mat for a couple of bucks. Pretty easy to process and make. EA is another important plant. This is in the same family as pandanus. And you find this growing high up in the mountains. But it actually wasn't the leaves that was most utilized by Polynesian cultures. Instead, it was these roots. It forms these sort of aerial roots. And you can harvest those roots and weave them into nice baskets. So this is an example from your textbook of a gentleman from, where is he from? Actually, I don't remember where he's from. Oh, from Manau, weaving a fish trap out of EA roots. Again, and this is how they would catch their fish. They deploy this trap into streams, and fish swim into it and can't get out. Uki is another one. This is a plant that we have it growing in our St. John courtyard. Maybe you've seen it. It's in the lily family. And you can just dry the leaves in the shade, and you don't even have to process them. You just take those leaves and you can braid them and turn them into a sort of a rough cordage. The berries, incidentally, are really bright purple too, and so this is an important dye that you can use for dyeing tuppa cloth and other things. Okay, so that's what I want to say about cordage. I'm going to turn on the lights for a second and give you guys a break from the slideshow, and I'll talk about our plans for the day. I'll pass this one out. And I'm going to break my rule about never presenting plants that have anything to do with the topic of the lecture, because this actually does have a lot to do with the topic of the lecture. Does anybody know what these plants are? Do you recognize these? So this is mamaki. This is a native Hawaiian plant, endemic to Hawaii. It's in the stinging nettle family. And it's probably most famously used for medicines. So if you have a sore throat, like a lot of you do now, apparently, based on the emails I got from people at the jam. What you can do is you can take all of these leaves and make a nice tea out of it. And it's really got a great sweet flavor. It almost tastes like honey. It's really soothing for your throat. You can go out and collect it if you can find it, or you can buy mamaki tea from, I think you can even buy it at Long's. They sell it. So, and this was a traditional medicine for Hawaiians too. But the other use that's maybe less known is that the fibers on this plant, being in the stinging nettle family, are pretty strong. And you can actually make this into a cloth, just like you can for kapa using the bouquet plant. So it's much less known and much less utilized, but there are some really fine examples of nice, thin, delicate cloth that's made from, I believe it's from the leaves of this plant. Again, at Bishop Museum, you can see some of those on display. So that was sort of if you were a really good craftsman or craftswoman, you might be able to coerce those plants into a nice thin cloth. Yeah. This plant is called mamaki. I should have written it out here. Mamaki. The other interesting thing about this plant is that it has its fruits. It has a cauliflory, right? So it means its fruits grow off of the branch. So you see these clusters of this little white fruit. It actually looks like cauliflower, but it's also sort of sweet too. It tastes like candy. So whenever I'm out hiking with my son, you can always spot mamaki, and he'll go harvest that and munch on it on our way. This is it's not an uncommon plant. You can find big patches of it around, but it's also harder and harder to find, I think. Okay, so this is a good segue into bark cloth. I asked you guys to watch a video all about bark cloth in Tonga, and it's sort of fun because that's one culture that takes its bark cloth really seriously for ceremony, and near the park near where I live, a lot of times I'll actually see Tongans out sort of airing out their bark cloth in preparation for celebrations like weddings. So this is still a really active part of the culture in Hawaii and elsewhere throughout the Pacific. I just want to show you the long video that I asked you to watch for homework is much more involved and goes into detail about that culture. I just wanted to show you a little bit of the process of making bark cloth.
The constant tap, tap, tap of the tabernacle rings out in every village at any hour of the day. Mothers, daughters, and granddaughters all take part, with a skill that comes from years of practice. The inner bark of the paper mulberry tree provides the fabric for the traditional cloth that can still be seen in most homes. It is stripped from a 3-inch diameter stalk and soaked in water, then pounded thinly and evenly with a traditional 4-sided pound. When enough of the single sheets are ready, they are glued together with arrowroot or tapioca into a completed cloth that may attain a length of 25 meters. Natural dyes are rubbed over the relief patterns to transfer the designs. Originally, the patterns and designs were family crests and symbols, but today they're freely interpreted by the artists. When the pattern is dry, the decorative outlines are highlighted by hand with a natural brush made from the fruit of the pandanus tree. Tongan families once measured their wealth by the amount of tapa cloths and mats they could produce. These cloths are still the gift to give at births, deaths, or marriages. These newlyweds are displaying their wedding gifts all the way to their new home. The woven mat skirts worn here by the bridal couple and the guests are another traditional craft. The mats are worn on formal occasions and whenever a Tongan wishes to show respect. The older the mat, the more highly prized.
So the whole process of weaving, right, of creating a yarn and then weaving that either on a loom or by hand or by knitting is something that not every culture learned how to do or felt was worthwhile developing that skill. Instead, what we find is in a lot of cultures, cloth and fabrics and textiles were made by some variation on what you just saw, finding natural fibers in some bark and then pounding that bark and somehow stitching it or gluing it together to make cloth. So we find examples of bark cloth from all over the world, right? So this is from the Amazon. This is a skirt from the Amazon over here. We have examples from Uganda and Africa, all over the Pacific. Bora Bora. This is again South Pacific. So this is something that turned up again and again. And most of these barks come from trees that are in the ficus genus, so the fig genus, or the banyan tree is part of this group of plants. And as is paper mulberry, that plant that you saw, that the Hawaiians also use and that you guys are going to pound in your next lab. And so it's just that genus of plant really has the characteristics that makes for easy bark cloth pounding. And so it's interesting to think about one of our favorite stories from the Bible, which is Adam and Eve, when they recognized their nakedness after Eve ate the apple. They realized they were naked, and so they ran to cover themselves up with the fig leaf, right? A lot of people think that this story is probably some bastardization of this idea that cloth used to be made from fig barks, really. Probably not the fig leaf itself, but the bark of the fig tree. And so that story is sort of being told and told orally over the years changed so that Adam and Eve grabbed the fig leaf instead of grabbing fig bark that they could cover themselves up with. But I wasn't there, so I'm not sure. So you'll learn in that video and in the one that you're going to watch, they talk about bark cloth as tapa, right? So they talk about pounding the tapa. And everywhere else in Polynesia, that's what it's called. In Hawaii, we call it kapa. So that T changed from a T to a K when it came to Hawaii. So don't get confused when you hear it called tapa or kapa by different people who know it by slightly different names. The star of this show is vauke. That's the Hawaiian word for this paper mulberry plant, whose Latin name is Braucinetia papifera. And it's in the Moraceae family, which is, again, the mulberry family. And this is what it looks like, and this is how it grows. Again, you grow this in patches, so this was something that was brought over. And you have plantations. This is the main clothing plant, right? So people had to clothe themselves, or they would get cold, or they wanted to cover themselves up. So you'd have lots of plantations of paper mulberry growing, and people would tend to them. Because you peel off the inner bark and then pound it to make lengths of cloth, it was very important that you trim off branches, so you have a nice strong stem that isn't broken up by branches poking through, because those will poke holes in your cloth, right? So people would tend these vauke patches and trim off the branches so you had single, long, tall growing stems. You want to harvest it when it's about 3 inches in diameter. If you had that luxury, you'd peel off the inner bark, red it for a couple of weeks so that only the fiber cells remain, and then you pound it like you saw in this video, in the video for your homework. Once you had a nice length of cloth, then you could adorn it. And so different cultures had different way of adorning their tapa. The Hawaiian way to adorn mostly used these bamboo stamps. So each one of these is a length of bamboo that's been cut, and then they've carved in these patterns, some of which probably may seem familiar to you, like the triangle patterns or the circle patterns. This is sort of a new one, which is a breadfruit motif. So you can take these stamps, you can dip it in a dye, and then stamp it in repeating patterns onto kapa to get sort of a nice look. Like this. These would be examples of traditional tapa motifs. There's a whole bunch of artists now that are doing modern takes on tapa, that are using modern motifs, but using these traditional processing methods to generate. There's a great exhibit up now at Bishop where you can see some of these new young artists that are working with tapa as a medium. Some of the dyes that you see here, this purple comes from the uki flowers or fruits, that lily that I showed earlier, or else kukui nut can make a nice dye of that color. The yellow that you see in the middle probably comes from noni root. So that fruit that people use medicinally, actually if you harvest the root of that, you can get a really bright yellow vibrant dye out of it. You can get pinks from things like raspberries. Will make nice pink dyes as well. So you generate your tapa and then you stamp it with some of these nice colors to get nice images on the surfaces of it. And a lot of cultures did something like this, either painted on their tapa or else stamped to get some of those designs. We saw in Tonga they used this technique of having doing the equivalent of like tombstone rubbing, right? So they had a design that was carved into some plate, and then you could paint over that and get that design printed on your surface of your tapa. One thing that was unique to Hawaii that, as far as we know, no other culture really developed this technique was watermarking. And so watermarking is the same idea, like if you hold up a dollar bill to the light, And you can see that there's certain hidden designs, right, that you can only see if you hold it up to the light. So there's parts of the dollar bill that are a little bit thinner or more transparent for some reason and have these designs underneath. You can't see it if the bill is sitting on a table, but if you hold it up to the light, you can see that light poke through. And so Hawaiians developed a very similar technique where they would use very heavy mallets that had these designs carved into it. And by very carefully pounding the tapa while it was still wet with this design, they'd create portions of tapa that was thinner, where the light would shine through. So if you hold it up to the light, you can see these very fine watermarking designs. And they're really spectacular. And again, this is something that was unique to Hawaiian tapa. Another characteristic of Hawaiian tapa was the scenting of that tapa. And so some of the typical plants that were used to scent tapa would be maile, the same plant that you use to make maile lei out of, coconut oil, or sandalwood, are some of these nice aromatic plants. There's this interesting plant that you hear in the old chants of the old stories where people would store their tapa in boxes that were lined with the lauae plant, lauae. And so people heard this story and tried to figure out what the lauae plant was. Now, if you grew up here, maybe you've heard lauae in reference to this miley-scented fern. That's like a real common landscaping plant. It grows all around campus, right? It smells like miley, but it's this little fern. And we call that lauae. And so for the longest time, people just assumed that this was the plant that turned up in all of these old chants. Well, it turns out that people did some studies on the genetics of this plant and recreated sort of its arrival to Hawaii. It's not native to Hawaii, and it probably only arrived at the very end of the 1800s by way of Palmyra Atoll. So that couldn't be the plant that Hawaiians were using. So it launched into this whole long sort of battle between people trying to figure out which plant these chants were referring to. And we still really don't know for sure, but we think maybe it's this other fern that has a nice scent. But it's an interesting question. It's this lost name and use that we have that we can't put a plant to. And so people are actively working on that. Well, I covered a lot of ground today. I'll leave you with some key concepts about Hawaiian use of cordage and other types of fibers. And what I really want to stress is that not just in Hawaii, but all around the world, cordage, which may seem like a really insignificant sort of subsection of ethnobotany, of what you use to tie things together, is really critical for construction, for hunting and fishing, and for survival. And so people spend a lot of time and effort making sure they have the proper rope. Olana is another really special plant that we talked about today that's not strictly a fiber, but is a native Hawaiian plant that's really waterproof, has good flexibility, and was really important in marine systems. Hawaiian kapa is something that's pretty special, although there's so many cultures that use bark cloth. Sort of the scentedness and the watermarking of Hawaiian kapa sets it apart from the rest. And you'll see some of these examples in class. Well, I ended with enough time for questions for once. So does anybody have any questions about any of these fiber plants that we looked at today? I can go back to the key concepts. And remember, I post these PDFs online too, so you can see them at your leisure. Anything else? Great, guys. Well, enjoy your long weekend, and we'll see you on Monday. Thanks. Super.